The sun hung low over Dusty Creek, painting the desert town in shades of gold and crimson. Samuel Hart stood on the wooden porch of the general store, his weathered hands gripping the railing as he watched the stagecoach prepare for departure. Inside that coach sat the only woman who had ever made his heart skip beats like a broken clock. Margaret Sullivan smoothed her blue traveling dress and adjusted her bonnet through the small window. Her green eyes, once filled with warmth when they looked at Samuel, now held only sadness and determination. She had made her choice, and nothing in this God-forsaken town could change her mind. Her father had arranged a marriage with a wealthy banker in San Francisco, and duty called louder than love ever could. Samuel's throat felt drier than the desert wind. 3 months ago, he had been the happiest man in Arizona territory. Margaret would smile at him across the church pews on Sundays, and they would take long walks along the creek that gave the town its name. She would laugh at his clumsy jokes and listen patiently as he shared his dreams of expanding his small ranch into something grand enough to support a family. But dreams meant nothing when reality came knocking. Margaret's father, the town banker, had made it clear that a struggling rancher was not suitable for his daughter. The drought had killed most of Samuel's cattle, and his debts were mounting higher than the surrounding mesa. When the marriage proposal came from California, it offered not just security for Margaret, but salvation for her family's failing bank. The stagecoach driver climbed onto his seat and gathered the reins. The 4 horses stamped their hooves, eager to begin the long journey west. Samuel felt his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Every instinct screamed at him to run down those steps, to stop the coach, to beg Margaret to reconsider. Instead, he remained frozen, watching the woman he loved slip away like sand through his fingers. The rational part of his mind knew she was making the right choice. What could he offer her? A leaky roof, empty pastures, and a future filled with uncertainty. She deserved silk dresses and fine china, not the rough life of a frontier wife. Margaret turned her head toward the general store, and for a moment their eyes met across the dusty street. Samuel saw tears glistening on her cheeks, and his own vision blurred. She raised one gloved hand in a small, heartbreaking wave. Samuel lifted his hand in response, knowing it was goodbye. The driver cracked his whip, and the horses lurched forward. The stagecoach wheels began to turn, kicking up small clouds of dust that danced in the evening light. Margaret's face disappeared from the window as the coach picked up speed, heading toward the main road that would take her out of Dusty Creek forever. Samuel gripped the railing tighter, his knuckles white beneath the sun-darkened skin. The sound of hoofbeats and creaking wheels grew fainter with each passing second. Soon, the stagecoach would reach the bend in the road, and Margaret would be gone from his sight completely. Something inside Samuel's chest cracked like ice on a winter pond. The pain was sharp and immediate, stealing his breath and making his legs weak. He thought of all the words he had never said, all the promises he had never made, all the dreams they had never shared aloud. Fear had kept him silent, and now silence would be his companion for the rest of his days. The stagecoach was almost to the bend now, becoming smaller and smaller against the vast landscape. Samuel closed his eyes and whispered the words he should have spoken months ago. The words that might have changed everything if he had found the courage to say them when it mattered. Margaret, I love you. His voice was barely audible, carried away by the desert wind before it could reach anyone's ears. It was too little, too late, a whisper lost in the immensity of the frontier. Samuel opened his eyes and watched the stagecoach disappear around the bend, taking with it his heart and his hopes for happiness. But something extraordinary happened in that moment of despair. The wind, which had been blowing steadily from the east, suddenly shifted direction. It caught Samuel's whispered words and carried them across the desert like a prayer given wings. The whisper rode the breeze, growing stronger instead of weaker, as if the very air itself understood the importance of the message it carried. Inside the stagecoach, Margaret sat rigid against the hard leather seat, fighting back tears that threatened to fall like rain. The elderly woman across from her offered a sympathetic smile, but Margaret could not return it. Her heart felt like it was being torn in two, with one half staying in Dusty Creek and the other traveling toward an uncertain future. She thought of Samuel standing on that porch, looking so tall and strong yet utterly defeated. She had wanted to run to him, to throw her arms around his neck, and declare that love mattered more than money or social position. But practical considerations had won, as they always did in her family. Security trumped passion, and duty conquered desire. The stagecoach hit a rut in the road, jolting Margaret from her melancholy thoughts. Through the window, she could see they were approaching the bend that would take them out of sight of Dusty Creek. Once they passed that point, there would be no turning back. No last glimpses of the town where she had been truly happy for the first and only time in her life. As the coach rounded the bend, something impossible happened. A whisper, clear as church bells and soft as a mother's lullaby, drifted through the window and directly into Margaret's ear. 3 simple words that stopped her heart completely. "Margaret, I love you." The voice was unmistakably Samuel's, though logic insisted it was impossible for his words to reach her across such a distance. Margaret's hand flew to her chest as her heart began racing like a runaway horse. The elderly woman looked at her with concern, asking if she felt faint, but Margaret could not respond. Those whispered words echoed in her mind, drowning out the sound of wheels and hoofbeats and her own doubts about the future. Samuel loved her. He had finally said it, even if only the wind had been there to hear. But somehow, impossibly, she had heard it too. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. The impossible whisper still echoed in her ears, Samuel's voice as clear as if he were sitting beside her in the stagecoach. She pressed her hand against the window, watching Dusty Creek disappear behind the rocky hills, but the words followed her like faithful companions. "Driver, stop the coach!" Margaret called out suddenly, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. The elderly woman across from her, Mrs. Grew Henderson, looked startled. "My dear, whatever is the matter?" "I must go back," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Please, driver, turn around immediately." The stagecoach slowed and came to a halt beside a cluster of desert willows. The driver, a grizzled man named Jake, who had seen plenty of strange behavior in his 20 years of frontier travel, climbed down and opened the door. His weathered face showed confusion and concern. "Miss Sullivan, we've only been traveling 15 minutes. Did you forget something important?" Margaret gathered her skirts and stepped down from the coach, her legs unsteady, but her resolve growing firmer with each breath of desert air. "Yes, Jake, I forgot the most important thing of all." Mrs. Henderson leaned forward in her seat. "Margaret, dear, think about what you're doing. Your father, the wedding arrangements, your future in California." "My future isn't in California," Margaret replied, removing her traveling bonnet and letting her auburn hair catch the evening breeze. "My future is back in Dusty Creek, with a man who loves me enough to whisper it to the wind when he thinks no one can hear." Jake scratched his gray beard and looked between the two women. "Ma'am, if you're set on returning, I can take you back, but I'll have to charge extra for the trouble. And Mrs. Henderson here has a schedule to keep." "I'll walk," Margaret said simply. "It's not far, and I need the time to think about what I'm going to say." Mrs. Henderson gasped. "Walk, alone, in this wilderness? Margaret, that's completely improper and dangerous, besides." But Margaret was already retrieving her small carpetbag from the coach. She handed Jake a silver coin for his trouble and smiled at Mrs. Matt Henderson. "Please give my apologies to Mr. Curra. Whitmore, when you reach San Francisco, tell him I've discovered something more valuable than all his gold." With that, Margaret turned and began walking back toward Dusty Creek, her blue dress a bright spot against the muted colors of the desert landscape. Behind her, she heard Jake and Mrs. Henderson discussing whether they should force her back into the coach, but their voices soon faded as the stagecoach continued its journey west without her. The walk back to town gave Margaret time to understand the magnitude of her decision. She was throwing away security, disappointing her family, and breaking an engagement to a man she had never met, but who represented everything her father thought she should want. Yet with each step toward Dusty Creek, her heart felt lighter instead of heavier. Meanwhile, Samuel remained on the general store porch, staring at the empty road where the stagecoach had disappeared. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that he barely noticed. Store owner Bill Morrison came out to sweep the porch and found Samuel standing like a statue. "Sam, you've been out here near an hour," Bill said gently. "Maybe it's time to head home?" Samuel nodded but made no move to leave. Home meant his empty cabin where Margaret had never been but where he had imagined her 1,000 times. It meant lying awake all night, wondering what might have been if he had been braver, richer, or simply luckier. "She made the right choice," Samuel said quietly, more to himself than to Bill. "She'll have a good life in California. Better than anything I could give her." Bill paused in his sweeping and studied Samuel's face. "Maybe so, but you look like a man who's lost something precious. Sometimes the right choice and the happy choice aren't the same thing." Before Samuel could respond, Bill pointed down the road toward the bend. "Say, Sam, is that someone walking this way?" Samuel looked up and saw a small figure in blue making its way along the dusty road. At first he thought it might be his imagination playing cruel tricks. But as the figure drew closer, his heart began to race. The walk was familiar, the color of the dress unmistakable. "Margaret," he whispered, then louder, "Margaret!" He vaulted over the porch railing and ran down the street, his boots kicking up clouds of dust with each step. Other townspeople began to notice the commotion and came out of their shops and homes to see what was happening. The blacksmith stopped his hammering, the saloon doors swung open, and even the preacher emerged from the church. Margaret saw Samuel running toward her and dropped her carpetbag in the middle of the road. She gathered her skirts and ran to meet him, her heart singing with each step. When they reached each other, Samuel swept her up in his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. "You came back," Samuel said, setting her down but keeping his hands on her shoulders as if she might disappear again. "Why did you come back?" Margaret reached up and touched his cheek, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "Because I heard you, Samuel. I heard what you whispered." Samuel's face showed confusion. "That's impossible. You were too far away, and I barely spoke above a breath." "The wind carried your words to me," Margaret said simply, "and they stopped my heart long enough for me to remember that love is worth more than all the gold in California." Around them, the townspeople had gathered, watching the reunion with smiles and knowing looks. Bill Morrison wiped his eyes with his sleeve, and even the stern banker, Margaret's father, who had emerged from his office, seemed moved by the scene. Samuel looked into Margaret's eyes and saw his entire future reflected there. "Margaret Sullivan, I love you with all my heart and soul. I don't have much to offer except a struggling ranch and a promise to love you every day for the rest of my life." "That's more than enough," Margaret replied. "That's everything." They kissed then, right there in the middle of the dusty street, with half the town watching and the desert wind swirling around them like a blessing. It was a kiss that tasted of desert sage and future promises, of whispered words carried on impossible breezes, and love strong enough to stop a heart and start it again. News of Margaret's dramatic return spread through Dusty Creek like wildfire in dry grass. Within an hour, everyone knew that the banker's daughter had abandoned her arranged marriage to return to Samuel Hart. Some whispered disapproval behind closed doors, while others smiled knowingly and remembered their own young romances. Margaret's father, Richard Sullivan, stood in his bank office staring out at the celebration forming in the street. His carefully laid plans had crumbled like sandcastles before an ocean wave. The marriage to Whitmore would have solved all his financial problems, but, looking at his daughter's radiant face, he found his anger softening into something resembling understanding. Samuel and Margaret walked hand in hand toward the Sullivan house, knowing they had to face Richard's wrath together. The banker met them at his front gate, his face stern but his eyes showing more resignation than fury. "Margaret Elizabeth Sullivan," Richard began formally, "do you understand what you've done?" "The disgrace to our family name, the business consequences." Margaret lifted her chin defiantly. "I understand that I nearly made the biggest mistake of my life, Papa. I understand that love is more important than money or social position. Love doesn't pay debts or put food on the table, Richard replied, though his voice lacked its usual authority. Samuel stepped forward, hat in hand. Mr. Sullivan, I know I'm not the man you chose for Margaret, but I swear on my mother's grave that I'll work every day to be worthy of her. My ranch may be struggling now, but I have plans to turn it around. Richard studied Samuel's earnest face. He had known the young man since childhood, had seen his character tested by drought and hardship. Samuel Hard might be poor, but he was honest, hard-working, and devoted to Margaret. Perhaps those qualities counted for more than he had previously believed. What plans? Richard asked, surprising both young people with his willingness to listen. Samuel's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. There's a new railroad coming through Phoenix. They'll need beef to feed the workers, and I know where to find water year-round for cattle. I've been studying the land, talking to other ranchers. With a small loan to buy breeding stock, I could be profitable within 2 years. Margaret squeezed Samuel's hand, pride shining in her face. She had always known he was intelligent and ambitious, but hearing him speak with such passion and confidence made her heart swell with love and admiration. Richard was quiet for a long moment, his business mind calculating possibilities. Finally, he sighed deeply. Come into my office tomorrow morning, Samuel. We'll discuss terms for that loan. Margaret gasped and threw her arms around her father's neck. Papa, thank you. Don't thank me yet, Richard said gruffly, but his expression had softened. This is a business decision, nothing more. If Samuel fails, you'll both pay the consequences. As the evening progressed, the impromptu celebration in the street grew larger. Someone brought out a fiddle, and couples began dancing under the desert stars. Margaret and Samuel found themselves at the center of attention, but they only had eyes for each other. I can't believe you heard my whisper, Samuel said as they swayed to the music. It doesn't seem possible. Margaret smiled mysteriously. Maybe it wasn't possible. Maybe it was something else entirely. What do you mean? Maybe it wasn't your whisper that reached me, Margaret said softly. Maybe it was my heart finally finding the courage to hear what it had been telling me all along. Samuel considered this, then nodded slowly. Perhaps the wind just gave us both the excuse we needed to do what we should have done months ago. Perhaps, Margaret agreed, but I prefer to think that love can work miracles when it's strong enough and true enough. As they danced, the whole town seemed to come alive around them. Old Mrs. Hartwell, the schoolteacher, told anyone who would listen that she had always known those two were meant for each other. Young Billy Thompson asked his sweetheart to marry him right there on the spot, inspired by the romantic reunion he had witnessed. Even the cantankerous saloon keeper bought a round of drinks for the house, declaring that love deserved to be celebrated. The dancing continued well past midnight, but eventually the crowd began to thin as people returned to their homes and beds. Samuel walked Margaret to her father's house, both of them reluctant to end the magical evening. I'll see you tomorrow? Margaret asked, her hand resting on the gate latch. Every tomorrow for the rest of our lives, Samuel promised. They kissed goodnight under the stars, a gentle, sweet kiss that held promises of all the tomorrows to come. Margaret watched from her bedroom window as Samuel walked back toward his ranch, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the darkness. 6 months later, Samuel and Margaret were married in the little church where they had first noticed each other years before. Samuel's ranch had indeed prospered with the railroad's arrival, and Richard Sullivan's loan had been repaid ahead of schedule. The banker had even grudgingly admitted that his son-in-law had good business sense. Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and Samuel wore his finest suit, purchased specially for the occasion. The church was packed with well-wishers, and the celebration afterward lasted until dawn. Years passed, and the story of Margaret's return to Dusty Creek became local legend. Children would beg their grandparents to tell them about the whisper that stopped a woman's heart and changed 2 lives forever. Some versions of the story claimed it was divine intervention, others credited desert magic, and still others insisted it was simply the power of true love. Samuel and Margaret never grew tired of telling their own version of events. They raised 4 children on the prosperous ranch, and each child grew up hearing about the day their mother chose love over security, and their father found the courage to speak his heart to the wind. On quiet evenings when the desert breeze stirred the curtains in their bedroom window, Samuel and Margaret would remember that magical moment when love proved stronger than fear, when a whisper carried on the wind changed everything. They would hold each other close and whisper their own promises into the darkness, knowing that some words are too important to be spoken aloud, and some love stories are too powerful to be explained by logic alone. The wind still blows across the desert around Dusty Creek, carrying whispers and secrets and the dreams of lovers. And sometimes, when the conditions are just right and love is strong enough, those whispers find exactly the hearts they're meant to reach.